Redémarrons la session par un dialogue et on va plonger dans un autre outil. Donc on a quitté les musées pendant
Okay, let's get back. Let's start again. We're going to talk about a different aspect now. We're moving away from museums. We're talking now about cultural routes, cultural itineraries, wine culture routes, wine culture itineraries. We have Emanuela Panke who's going to do this. She's going to be responding a bit to what we've heard from already this morning or we'll hear later. So, and I'd be interested in during this session if you could to raise your hands if you have at any time, rather than keeping the questions all to the end. When they tend to pile up, we'll have some questions throughout if you'd like to raise your hand for a question. Emil, over to you. Thank you very much, Claudia. Thank you, all of you. Thank you for the invitation to address you today. I am the president of the Iter Vitis Federation, and we're very honoured indeed to be partners of the Cité du Vin and the Cité du Vin Foundation, and partners in this wonderful colloquium, which have been something we've been talking about and dreaming of organising for many years now. So when they gave me the title they'd asked me to talk about, I was a little bit nervous, I must admit, because cultural itineraries, cultural routes, I could probably spend the rest of the year talking about it. So how to keep it down to 30 minutes is a bit of a daunting task, but we've just had a coffee break. I hope you're all feeling suitably dynamised and ready to go. But I'm going to start with a brief overview description of the program, the Iter Vitis program, the context in which it operates. It's a program launched by the Council of Europe, the Cultural Route program. It started 45 years ago now with the Santiago de Compostela route being the first recognised route. It's now been expanded to encompass almost 50. We're actually precisely 49 cultural routes all over Europe. I really wanted to show you the map because the Council of Europe is geographical Europe. It's not the European Union. It stretches from Ukraine to the Azores Islands to the very north of coast of Africa also. Now, the cultural routes in France, there are 36 of them, which pass through France at least at some point, and I've given you a list here for France and for all of the cultural routes found across the entire continent of Europe, just to give you some idea of the scale of this program, and that Iter Vitis, the cultural routes of wine, coexists alongside more traditional architectural material, such as we have the Phoenician trails, the Impressionist trail, just to cite a few examples. So there's art, there's archaeology, there's history. And religion, there's Santiago de Compostela as well, but there's also the Via Francigena. And in 2007, there's a beautiful photo which we include in the exhibition, which you can see downstairs. That's the Temple of Agrigento in Sicily, which is surrounded by an archaeological park, which includes a beautiful vineyard. We started in 2007, this idea to put together an application to the Council of Europe. At the time, there were only 24 cultural routes in Europe, and the process for getting a new cultural route was very rigid. It was very difficult to get the certification for a new cultural route. So we decided to put together an application for Iter Vitis, wine routes, to have wine routes given their own category. So unlike Santiago de Compostela, which is a famous pilgrimage route, that's a very linear route. With the Iter Vitis, with the wine routes, they're much more scattered across the European continent and beyond. Sometimes they stray far beyond. You have Tunisia, Lebanon, Israel, and also countries in South America who have their own routes. So we now have 26 member countries in the Iter Vitis organization. We started out with just 3 or 4, but this 20 years ago. So that this connection between wine and culture, between vines and culture, remains strong. And in terms of numbers, we started with 15 members. We've expanded to 26 in the space of just a few years. So there really is an accelerating, growing interest and recognition for the importance of the value of this support that we offer to the economy, the value of culture and wine culture to the economy. And I'm going to hear a little bit here from some of my colleagues who helped me put this together. As I said, Iter Vitis exists across 26 member countries. We have it goes as far east as Ukraine. It used to be Russia before the war. We also have France, Italy, Spain, North Africa, Greece, because we're talking about the real historic homes of wine growing. In each country, we have put together the things we put together really respond to the demands, the expectations on the ground in each country, because the expectations of Turkey are not the same as the expectations you find in Italy or France or emerging destinations such as Bosnia and Herzegovina or Moldova. So we're working in different ways in different countries, but they're really at the basis of all our work. And I'll give you an example in a moment of the work we do with my colleague Nathalie Kaltenbach here in France. We're going to have an excellent event which is going to be hosted here at the Cité du Vin shortly to celebrate the new wine route in Turkey. We've also very recently put together a wine route in Moldova, the first wine tourism routes in Moldova. At the heart of what we do, all our work, is to work in close collaboration with local communities, with the know-how, the expertise that we find on the ground, and the culture of wine that exists on the ground, in a way which is a little less top-down, a little less aristocratic, to try and be more democratic in our approach. And to communicate about wine in a manner which is more approachable, which is more better adapted to different audiences, highlighting wine as an accessible product for everybody. And of course, wine as a vector of culture, as a product which could be intimately collected with themes of art, architecture, archaeology. And that's why I wanted to hand over to my colleague Vanessa Ferey, who's a museum director, because we often interact with Vanessa. We have discussions about the importance of involving local communities, of working to promote and champion know-how, expertise. A good example being the know-how in the Cognac region. We talked about that this one, but also what you have in the Cité du Vin, an excellent example of an innovative, interactive museum as a way of sharing experiences with younger generations, people who might not necessarily be so interested in wine. So Vanessa, if you'd like to chip in at this point. And then we'll talk a bit more about Iter Vitis afterwards. Thank you, Emanuela. I'm delighted to be here with you at the Cité du Vin. As you said, yes, we've been working together for a little while already now to promote our new European route, which is celebrating the Cognac's history. I'd say it's really rooted in the DNA of Cognac, that idea of social cohesion there. The fact that Cognac is as a UNESCO intangible cultural heritage site, and that is a lot of that is due to the expertise, the know-how which is embodied in the landscape of the people and the invisible infrastructure of Cognac, which has earned us recognition all over the world, not only in wine fairs and budget fairs, the commercial side of Cognac. What we want to emphasize is how over 500 plus years, the culture of Cognac has been a force for connection, and hence we were delighted to join the Iter Vitis European Cultural Route. This scheme, which really puts the emphasis on the human connections which spring up around the landscapes of wine and vines. There are new trends in the way they present these things in terms of museographical design, emerging trends which really highlight the importance of communities and the better understanding and analyzing the influence of the community and the reciprocal influences between local people and the iconic products they produce. Since the 1970s, there's been a movement, what we call the international movement for new museography, new museum form presentation. It's a tendency which these days is often grouped under the heading of what we call socio-museology. It's about exploring the things that fly under the radar, the unseen forces behind it. How can we continue to make cultured reality. And places like the Cité du Vin are really really on board with that trend of better understanding the underlying force and the subject of connection, of underlying social connection is a problem, an issue which is taken really seriously now by UNESCO, among others. And our approach to museography in Cognac is entirely in accordance with that. As you may or may not know, about 95% of Cognac is exported worldwide. So so we truly appreciate the importance of the international connections and the European connections. Nonetheless, thank you very much. And Vanessa, do you want to go back to your? Yes, okay, yeah, I will go back now to my presentation, a bit more detail about our work, our activities, and how those activities relate to the work of the colleagues that I have with us. Oh, there it is. So I've lost a few slides. Right, so here's an example. It's archaeovinum, wine and archaeology. Very often, something that we hear time and time again at Iter Vitis is that wine tourism starts a lot earlier than we think. It's not when you step into a winery or go to a wine tasting that you become a wine tourist, because wine tourism begins as soon as you enter into an archaeological site, a museum. I'm not talking about just about a wine museum, but you go to a history museum, a museum of decorative arts, an archaeological museum. Here are some good examples of what I mean by that, of ways that highlight the connections between tourism and archaeology and the institutions which preserve and protect and make those accessible. This is Wine Stories by Iter Vitis. This is the top left image there. It's an application that we did. This is in the Archaeological Museum of Thessaloniki in Greece, which I think is one of the finest archaeological museums in Greece, in the world, indeed. You can go into this museum, Thessaloniki, and you can use this app, and it provides a visitor route through the museum, focusing on artifacts which have a specific connection to wine and the culture of wine. It might be a crater, an old wine cup, an amphora. So it's a really interesting opportunity for the museum. For a different way, you can visit the museum for a second time. For example, if you've already visited the museum in Thessaloniki, you may want to visit it from a different perspective and take a different route through the museum next time. This is one way. Or you might say, I'm not particularly interested in archaeology, but I love wine, so I'm going to visit this museum and it's going to teach me something about wine. And the fact that you have a wine itinerary is something that might attract you to that. Or you may be a lover of archaeology with not an awful lot of interest in wine. You might not have been aware that they make good wine in the region of Thessaloniki. So the fact that you can learn that there is such a long, rich history behind the wine that you may find yourself buying or drinking later. And for example, you might come out of that wanting to know more and realize there's a place that you can visit, a wine cellar you might wish to visit elsewhere in the region. So it's really sort of mutually beneficial to the wine industry and the archaeological museum. And above and beyond museums, there are also some beautiful archaeological sites scattered across Europe. We put together a whole collection now of Iter Vitis routes which pass through these archaeological parks. Here's an example of ancient wine presses in another part of Greece. Stone wine presses. You can find them in the Caucasus, in Greece, south of Italy, Spain, Portugal. Also, you find these ancient stone wine presses. There's some still left in France as well. We've actually created an archaeological route across Europe where you can go and visit these archaeological artifacts which exist within regions which are still producing wine to these days. So it's about enriching our understanding of the landscape with the input of archaeology. You can't really read the sign on the left from where you are, but it's probably the world's oldest archaeological site in Armenia. I know we have Armenian partners with us, where we are speaking to our Armenian friends. This is one of the most important. This Areni cave in Armenia. It's the first wine bar in history. And Iter Vitis has been involved in promoting that site. It's a way of promoting Armenia's wine-growing culture, and also to bring such a prestigious historical site into our international network. And on the last slide here, this is a Phoenician-era image. This is in Sardinia. This is on the bottom right. This is in Phoenician heritage and history. It's not something that's much talked about in wine growing, but it's about connecting that ancient wine culture with an ancient archaeological site. And Archeovinum in the middle, that is a conference which we'll be holding in Florence at the end of February. We're bringing together 10 archaeological sites. So we've got the Colosseum, we've got Pompeii, we've got Agrigento. A number of different archaeological sites have decided to replant vines within their confines because they were wine-growing sites in antiquity. So it's about that reciprocal promotion of ancient sites, archaeological sites, and the historic wine culture. And it's attracting a lot of interest. We know very well that culture needs support because. And that requires an economic input. It takes money, to put it very bluntly. And that's why a lot of winemakers have become sponsors of champions of this. There's a good example. This is the Barberini, which is presented near the Colosseum. There's a cooperative winery which has replanted wines in the vicinity of the Colosseum. And this example on the left is a Phoenician site in Sardinia. Again, it's a cooperative winery. The cooperative wineries play a really important role in maintaining social connections, but also as sponsors, as donors to these archaeological projects. They funded the cooperative winery. They funded all the visitor information signs which have sprung up, and they make Panelorica, which is the wine, which is the same name as the site. There's another example here from Kilis. Kilis is a winery which is subsidized a podcast, which is in French and in Turkish, introduced in Paris, launched recently in Paris. And they focus on the Hittite era of ancient Turkey and the winery and winemaking in the Hittite era. There's another example. There's a new, this is in Macedonia, North Macedonia, West Macedonia, sorry. About an hour and a half from Thessalonica. And that is from Boutaris. Boutaris was the former mayor of Thessaloniki, so he's known as the father of modern winemaking in Greece. He left an enormous book collection, enormous personal library. So his children and heirs founded an international library of agronomical, wine-growing, wine history books in West Macedonia. So the role played by donors, by sponsors, is extremely important. And which brings me very neatly on to the next person I'd like to hear from, a colleague from the Foundation for the Vivanco Museum, Carmen Bengoechea, who was Director of Customer Relations of the Vivanco Wine Museum. We've talked a little bit about Santiago several times already, the Compostela. But you talked a little bit about sponsorship in Moldova and other countries, and I'd like to hear more from you directly about that side of the business. Thank you very much, particularly to Philippe Massol and the Cité du Vin for the invitation to be here today. You have to pardon me if I don't get all my words out because French is not my first language, but I will try my best. For those who don't know our project Vivanco, the Culture Museum, it's a project which encompasses a focus on wine production, an experience, an immersive tourist experience, which is growing all the time. Here's the image. Our model is kind of modeled on a French chateau a little bit. It's right in the middle of the vines. So it really puts the accent on the landscape and keeps it rooted in the landscape. And the foundation for the museum is obviously committed to promoting the civilizational, cultural facets of our museum. And it really is a luxury to be able to work in this beautiful region. And we have 5 rooms in the museum, which offers a kind of visitor which takes readers through the whole story of wine growing. The room number 1 starts with wine production in the winery, in the vineyards. The second room is more about the industry, the wine industry more broadly, glass producers, corks, how barrels are made. The third room, which is what we're looking at here, this is room number 3. This is about work in the cellars. There is a 4th room, which I think really is the beating heart of our museum, and that's the arts room, where you can see a selection of archaeological artifacts, from Greco-Roman and Egyptian civilizations, loads of artifacts from wine history. And the fifth room is dedicated to the broader world of wine, and which contains the largest collection of corkscrews in the world. We've got more than 3,300 corkscrews on display, which, and as part of the cultural work, our foundation conducts a lot of special collections, special exhibitions as well, because we really have a really rich collection. And about 40% of our items are on display at any one time. So a lot of our collections are not on display. So we really do have a rich fund to draw, a rich archives to draw on to promote and champion this the heritage, the culture of wine. And as Véronique said a little bit earlier, so eloquently, the culture of wine and all its different manifestations, and that's what we tried to show in our museum. It's 100% privately funded. We have no public subsidies, no government subsidies, so it takes an awful lot of money and an effort to keep that show on the road, but unfortunately so far it's been a success. Well, thank you very much, and perhaps we could now hear from the Cité du Vin. Why not? But the first time that we're here to your first contribution to this this discussion about opening, because Carmen, I know you have close connections with the Cité du Vin. You were involved with the launch, and that collective spirit, that collaboration between different cultural centres and museums of wine across Europe is really interesting. And perhaps Philippe from the Cité du Vin, you'd like to respond immediately. Yes, this is fairly reason. I was very fortunate to be involved in the Cité du Vin project from the outset, and the first two museums that I went to visit during the presentation was the Vivanco Foundation and Santiago Vivanco, we talked about earlier. Santiago Vivanco is a member of our board of directors. Santiago Vivanco has been a member of the board since 2014. And the second place I went to visit was the Guinness Tour House, so very different. But if you ever do visit the Cité du Vin, the permanent exhibition, you see that those two visits, the first two visits that we went on, really did have a lasting influence and impact on what the Cité du Vin has become. What is new, I suppose, personally, my background wasn't really in wine, nor in Bordeaux. I'm not a scientist, nor am I really a cultural expert. So you might ask yourself what I'm doing here. Well, I mean, my professional background was primarily in marketing and theme parks, attractions, and so I was brought in really to help to make this idea of Alain Juppé and Sylvie Gaz and others who put this idea together. My idea was that I was brought in to become a reality. And so I really started learning about the world of wine in 2009 when the project got off going. So we spent some time traveling to a few places. Went to Italy also. There's a lovely museum in, I've forgotten where it is, Barolo, the Barolo Museum. And so we visited in Barolo. We started at Mira Natura, and we discovered the first Italy. You may be familiar with Italy. That chain is it's almost supermarket size épicerie, which is dedicated to Italian, and that actually greatly inspired the Aldebaccalon just across the road. So ultimately, this the Cité du Vin really would never have existed if we didn't have those connections with the outside world, people doing these similar things. Apart from the Vivanco Foundation in Logroño and the Amo Museum, the rest of the wine museums that exist in the world are really fairly traditional, quite staid. So it was by traveling and seeing how friends elsewhere were doing things that really helped us to make the Cité du Vin what it is. And since the Cité du Vin has been open, I think in 10 years, we must have welcomed about 40 delegations. I'd say 40 delegations from all over the world. Many from Asia, a lot of from different parts of China, but not just. We've had delegations from South America, and there have been projects for new museums in France. I'd say in terms of our positioning, we decided that here in Bordeaux, the Cité du Vin would be a universal temple to wine. It wasn't supposed to be just a museum for the history of Bordeaux wine. It was supposed to be a wine more universally. And there's the museum in Champagne now, in Burgundy more recently. They have their own cité. They're more territorially focused. A beautiful project which has not yet been completed in Porto, the World of Wine project in Porto. Which is, if you do get the opportunity, if you are in Porto, it really is worth a visit. What they've done there, and it's true that we're in dialogue, we're in constant discussion with these. Iter Vitis, in this respect, has been really important in opening the way to them. Florence Malfranc, who was here with us yesterday, she's done a great job of keeping us in touch with the 50+ partners all over the world of the interest in the wine culture. And since Emanuela has been in our lives, I mean, there've been projects galore. So I mean, what Emanuela has achieved is really impressive. I think it becomes visible when you look back and you look at what's happened over 10 years. Look at we tend to be focused on looking forward. And when we celebrate a milestone anniversary like this, it's an opportunity to take stock and look back, and you realise how far we've come. And no, that's fine. That's a good transition. That's the ideal transition. There's a good jumped up point because we talked about the wine routes, we talked about the specificities of wine tourism. Perhaps, Emanuela, it's time for you to continue. Tell us a bit more about the specificity of those tourist routes.
Thank you, Philippe. So, obviously, it's difficult when we start talking about these things. There are a lot of ideas, a lot of projects. So what I like when I came for the first time and saw the museum version of Iter Vitis, Philippe said, he talked about culture, but he understood immediately the value of culture. So in culture we have innovation, but also we need to be open to international partnerships, which are very important. We see this through the transnational Iter Vitis network, and that's why we have always been very keen to work together with the foundation for many years. So tourism is important. Our approach is that we've seen that with archaeology there is tourism because people visit museums, visit archaeological sites, and so people do wine tourism without realizing it. But another important thing, which also links in with tourism, and also an important part of building with narratives around wine as a cultural product, is ampelography. We invest a lot of energy in projects on ampelography and the study of the different grape varieties. And although until now it was considered very technical, as being reserved for people who work in wine growing, what we want to do is to try to provide an interpretation of ampelography in a more entertaining, fun way, to see how this can be a part of a cultural or diplomatic narrative, so to give the characteristics not only when we do the tastings, but also to talk about the history of the grape varieties, the DNA profile of the varieties, which shows the links between vineyards in Calabria and in Armenia. So to see how the vines have traveled around the world, analyzing the profile of vines that arrived in France with pilgrims from Compostela also shows the links. And these are all different stories which can contribute to inspiring our visitors and our consumers. And on this subject, I think we've done a lot of good work. And I think later we will talk about the days of ampelography. We've worked with different partners on this. Here you have a magnificent vineyard. You have the landscape. the cultivation, the pruning system, the gobelet. And here on sand, on the beach in Sardinia, with the Carignan variety, which is very ancient itself. And the two gentlemen here, my friends, who are putting up a sign in our garden of old native varieties in Calabria. It's an open-air museum of the ancient grape varieties from the different Iter Vitis countries, with a focus on Calabria, as this is a region which has varieties which were brought here by the Copts, the Christians from Egypt, and came here to Calabria. So obviously these are things I find extremely interesting, but I think these are things that can be presented to everybody. Or there's Malvasia, the ampelography of the Malvasia variety, which arrived from Greece, with the Venetians, arrived on the Adriatic coast, and then spread throughout Europe. And thanks to the myth of the Malvasia, we drew a map of the spread of this variety. And for wine tourism, as we saw earlier, that there is a walking route we showed in the north of Italy, but also we tried to use wine tourism in cities, for example in Rome or in Venice, as a tool to try to fight against mass tourism. Here you have a vineyard which was replanted on an island, a small island in the lagoon of Venice. And there are several vineyards on those small islands. And we've created this tour with a tour operator so that people can visit Venice through its vineyards. So Venice at present doesn't have a great image because of mass tourism, can really change its image through the presence of vineyards and this wine tourism, which is very much unexpected here. Another thing we're currently doing is in Rome. We already have the vines of the Colosseum, and we're also replanting vineyards where they used to be in ancient times, and even in more recent times. Rome was a city of wine right through to the beginning of the 19th century. After that, property development and archaeological digs meant that a lot of vineyards were uprooted, but now we're replanting small plots of vines to create a vineyard visitor itinerary within the city. So we see how we can work together on wines in innovative ways. We talked about ampelography, we've talked about tourism, and I think tourism, the terroir and ampelography are the things which are present very much in the Cité des Climats in Burgundy, presenting a very particular region, the region of Burgundy and its climat. So it's yet another view of what a museum can be. And so I'll hand over to Edouard Mognetti, who is the director of the Cité des Climats et Vins of Burgundy. Can you hear me? So hello, everybody. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to speak to you here today during this panel discussion. Two things I should point out regarding the Cité des Climats et Vins of Burgundy. First of all, the context and the behind the creation of this network of visitor centres. There is one main centre in Beaune and two others in Mâcon and Chablis. We were created further to the listing of the Climat de Beaune as UNESCO World Heritage of the Burgundy climate, and it was at the initiative of the Burgundy wine sector, who wanted to create a showcase for the general public that should be a must-see venue for people with an interest in Burgundy wines and their climat. And this is important, I think, to say. You talked about, you said we were a museum earlier, but I often say that we're not just a museum. Not that I don't want, not that the image of museums is something I see as negative, but we are much more than a museum. Obviously, one of our key features in our different sites is the scenography, as you see here, to improve people's understanding of our wines and the climat where they are produced. But we want this to be a comprehensive experience through the scenography and also through our reception areas, restaurants, cafes, wine schools. We propose an all-inclusive experience. And this is something I feel very strongly about, in that we should make wine accessible more generally, and in particular Burgundy wines. We must work on this overall visitor experience. Thank you. I agree, and I also see the role of the museum or the interpretation center or visitor center in a prestigious place like yours or at the Cité du Vin as an advertisement for the territory, because very often the role of the Museum 2.0 is to take people on a journey. We've seen the presentation, but we heard from our colleague from the Cité du Vin about how the visitors thank us for taking them on a journey. And also, in your case, as in museums in Greece or interpretation centers that are more modern, the aim really is to show all the things that are on the hinterland. So people visit the museum, perhaps the next day they might go see one or two wineries, or if they don't have time, they might organize a second trip to visit the surrounding area another time, or to see all the things that were presented in the visitor center. As far as we are concerned, we're going to turn now to the activities and the avenues for work for the future, for the near future. If we could put the photos back up on the screen. At the moment, we are working on a certain number of possibilities to broaden access to culture. And when I talk and here on the subject of wine and religion, we organize some conferences to explain the symbolism, role and interpretation of wine, as we saw in the presentation earlier also by Véronique. Starting in the distant past, the meaning of wine in the different religions. And I think it could be important also, once again, to put across, in order to put across a positive image of the consumption of wine, because we have worked with Orthodox Christian Jews working on objects related to wine and religion, the different vases or containers that exist in the different religions, but regarding the message and the concept of the perception of wine by the different religions, all the religions, in all the religions, share this vision of wine. Even the Calvinists see wine as being a way of enjoying ourselves and as something positive, provided that it is consumed with moderation. So wine is allowed, even appreciated, but as long as it's moderate consumption. And so I think talking about wine and its religious symbolism and the culture around wine and religion, I think, is a message that we can present to people, to get people to think about their wine consumption, not just as a pleasure, but also as a way of enjoying a special moment. And this also fits in with the morality and ethics of the different religions. And also, this is our way, because we, at the Council of Europe, we need to work on the values of the Council of Europe. And we talked about cultural diplomacy and also intercultural dialogue. And so wine is a fabulous tool for intercultural dialogue. We have worked with Lebanon and Israel, for example, with Armenia and Azerbaijan. So we have wine growers, we have people from the cultural sector. So politics is something that we have to set to one side so that we can sit down and communicate better. And there are other possibilities, notably for themed visitor routes. The most recent and modern is the Vermouth itinerary from Turin to Chamonix, with the history of vermouth and of its consumption in historic cafes, the use as an aperitif wine also of vermouth. And it's a way of showing also the differences, because there's not just one kind of vermouth. Vermouth is also linked to the landscape, because the herbs used in vermouth change depending on whether you're in Spain, in Catalonia, in Savoie, or in Turin. And so accordingly, the taste of the vermouth will change, the tasting experience will change depending on the landscape. And another route or itinerary is one in Bulgaria and Greece through Thrace. And so here the tourists can visit 2 or 3 countries on the same theme along these visitor routes. And also there's work between Ukraine, Moldova and Romania on civilization in ancient times which cultivated vines. And so we need to try to work in a cross-border manner between countries, even when they're on difficulty. Ukraine is currently in conflict. Moldova is next or close to a country in conflict. Things aren't easy there, but it's a way for us to work on constructing positive ideas for the future. And finally, there are more national themed routes. There's one of the wines, of biblical wines in the hills around Jerusalem, with archaeological sites that are found in the Old Testament, and the route of the Olympiads in Aegon and Corinth in Greece. And we have to see how we can use archaeological sites and the imagery associated with the Olympiads to promote a themed route that otherwise would have been the Aegon wine route. So we have to see how to combine these things so that they can be recognized internationally. So that's that sort of work, international work that we are doing in our extensive partnerships with the Cité du Vin. And that's how we found a way of discussing together. Thank you very much. What I suggest now is, first of all, a round of applause, because you're quite right. That work weaving these collaboration networks is very important, and Emanuela, and these links between each other are important. So perhaps before we resume our discussion, there might be some questions from the room that we haven't yet heard this morning. Is there anybody who would like to ask a question? I don't see you very well, but if you make a sign, I should be able to see if anybody has any questions or comments they'd like to make, or anything they'd like to challenge or to contest. Okay. In that case, I will begin. We have talked a lot about changes in the living world, that these things are not static, and one of these changes is to think about the 5 people who are sat here, to think about communities. And for this, I would like to turn to Vanessa, if you wouldn't mind. Because we have talked a lot about the ties between us, and of wine as a way of establishing ties between us. But Vanessa, could you share your work that you have done with us on the issue of communities? Thank you, Claudia. Yes, of course. The theme of the term community in the social and technical system that I analyze within the sector in Cognac, and in Cognac there are 75,000 jobs and also many companies in the Spirits Valley, 1,300 distillers and more than 280 Cognac houses. So it's an appellation that stretches from the Dordogne to the Ile de Ré, and there are here people upholding the traditions and know-how of the past and also social practices, which makes the work with the community something really important, really to make sure we include all the different entities that play a part, in addition to the local people, and they can all work to define community in the 2023 decision on the intangible heritage of humanity. This is said to be inclusive and diverse, and everything has to be done for the communities themselves and for themselves. And therefore, in this respect, what's important is to see how, in the local territories, the museums, whether they have collections or not, the museums, the interpretation centres, eco-museums, the interpretation centres or natural parks, or how they can all join forces with the community and how we can work on the social ties with them. And the idea of the 2003 convention, as has been seen extensively by Emanuela, is to work extensively together. And each year at UNESCO, you have working groups and intergovernmental committees that are there to protect or safeguard certain things, and notably the intangible heritage. And so every year there is a forum that is an opportunity to get all the NGOs together, provided they have accreditation by the UN, in order to discuss the problems that we all have in common. But in this case, regarding to questions of climate change or others. So I think here, this is where community is very important at European and international level, to try to not exclude, to avoid excluding certain stakeholders or certain forms of culture, certain types of tourists, really to try to have a creative tourism and to try to include every form of cultural life that we can in a given territory in order to provide some answers to the sustainable development objectives we all have to achieve. Thank you. I am looking to the room if anybody has any questions. Make a noise if you want to speak. In fact, we talked, it's true, when it's true with the term community or territory, and then there's also the terroir, which is different. We won't go into that because that would take days to discuss, but it might be worth somebody reacting on that point, because this means a lot to me. Here we're talking about wine and also about new communication. So what we have to see, what we can organize. It's really something quite close, but we're going to talk with Edouard in particular on the question of the economic model, because you have public and private models, public and private support, and this accessibility, which Emanuela talked earlier, is perhaps also linked with economic models and with entities or structures. Here we're at the Cité du Vin, but there are 5 or 6 examples that we've just mentioned of entities that need support. So how does this all work, and what would you suggest as the best way to work on this? Good question. In itself, the economic model is essential. As I've already said, the promise, at least for the Cité du Vin Climat of Burgundy, and I'm sure many others will agree with this, is that this wine should be generally accessible to the broadest possible audience. And to do this, we need to have a sustainable economic model And I'm sorry to bring this question of culture all the way back to something so mercenary as money, but we do need to have an economic model that is viable, so we have to work on this basis. Fundamentally, our cultural programming needs to be supported by a commercial effort. And just a moment to look at the screen. So he's saying, so it's a museum without works. The first guy saying, I don't understand, and the, sorry. So talking about the economic model, there is a question which has been mentioned a lot this morning regarding the collective effort. I'd like to come back to Vivanco and to Carmen on this question, which is your vision of the family trying in a way to return to the local territory, what the territory and wine have given themselves. And so I wanted to see how you, in very concrete terms, you experience this relationship with this family, the patrons, and at the same time are there to animate, to coordinate this community. I think this family and the fourth generation in Rioja Wines is a very humble family. Originally, they were farmers. The second generation, Pedro, the father of Santiago, always said, in fact, that they should share with society and give something back to the world of wine, give back what they had received from the family had received from the world of wine. And I heard him, and all this money that they had earned as entrepreneur, there wasn't something they wanted to waste. And he felt that, but he felt that all that money didn't belong to him, that he had to do something with it for society, or at least with a good part of it. And that's why the museum was created in 2004. And really, this was, it really caused a boom of wine tourism in the region. It's a process I experienced myself. As I'm old, I saw this with my own eyes. 20 years ago, we couldn't visit the wineries because they were closed, except if you were a friend of the owner or something like that. And in fact, there wasn't really, the sector wasn't professional in its approach. So Vivanco, with his brother, when they started working on this project, what they wanted to do something based on the culture of wine. And at the time, the other wine and winery owners looked at them strangely, sort of thinking that it might be something that might be interesting to develop in the future. But from a territorial point of view, in terms of the local development of that territory, it really was important for the region, not just for the villages. There are some very simple figures I would like to share with you. When Vivanco was built, in Leonas, the name of the small village, with barely 200 inhabitants, there was only one restaurant in the village at the time. And then now there are 6 restaurants, hotels, a luxury hotel, and also gîtes. And in Spain, we have a big problem of declining populations in rural areas. And this is one of the rare villages where the population is actually growing. But the trend there is very important. What I mean here is that in addition to the cultural work, the work on the museum and on wine culture, there is a genuine return on the investment in socio-economic terms, and I think that's very important for me. And there's something I heard this morning, I think Véronique, I can't remember who said that the culture of wine brings social cohesion. I think that is also very important.
Well, perhaps, Philippe, it would be time to talk about the Cité du Vin, how it fits into this this landscape. The Cité du Vin has something of a benchmark now. It's been a point of reference for 10 years now. Only think of most of your visitors, I suppose, are people who will come here one time only. So how do you approach that? How do you welcome people who are coming here for the first and only time? How do you welcome them in, and how do you bid them farewell? What's the message you want to leave them with? How do you leave the mark that you? How do you approach that relationship between tourism in Bordeaux more generally and with the visitors to the Cité du Vin? Well, I believe the starting point, when it started out, the Cité du Vin, when it was opened up here in Bordeaux, Bordeaux was already a big tourist destination, a very popular tourist destination. So the decision we made was to say, listen, what's missing in Bordeaux is something which is a major piece of the puzzle. People coming to visit Bordeaux for its wine history, which is surrounded by wineries, by vineyards, but they need to feel that presence in the city. It was lacking before, the people that can visit Bordeaux, the city, but also engage with the theme of wine within the city. To begin with, that was the starting mission. And when we started to design what would become the Cité du Vin, what the activities that would be contained within it, because the economic model was, of course, at the forefront of our considerations from the very beginning. So a lot of thought went into how the scientific project would complement and coexist with that economic prerogative, because and at the origin it was the foundation, which was the operating force behind the Cité du Vin, was planned for the long term. Then there were a certain number of choices which needed to be made, important decisions. For example, what would be our permanent collection, even though permanent is a slightly relative term here. We don't have a museum collection. And what are our special exhibitions, our temporary exhibitions? And when you're running a zoo, a fun fair, a park, it's all about creating emotions and moments, experiences for example, if you like roller coasters, you'll never get bored of going back on a roller coaster. So culture is different. To get people to come back, how do you get visitors to return? It's often by changing the exhibitions. It's often people come back again to visit a new museum. We imagine that here, this would be an important site for exhibitions. And we're actually relatively disappointed, not with the quality of the exhibitions, because we knew we had exhibitions of great quality, but the temporary exhibitions that we put on here didn't attract the sort of visitor numbers we were hoping for. So the space that we designed for a temporary exhibition has been actually transformed now into what we call the Via Sensorio. It's our sensory immersive exhibition. So we came to realize that the reality of this estate is not a place where people are going to visit again and again. It's not a regular tourism. And that's true, because 90% of our visitors every year are coming to us for the first time. Every year, 90%. When you know that, it becomes easier, it's become clearer to know what you're doing and where to invest your money. We're going to invest more in the permanent visitor experience, which has to be as attractive as possible and has to be something which really satisfies visitors, and that creates the positive word of mouth, which gets that positive virtuous circle, which brings people. If you ask our visitors, you ask them why they came today, so many of them, more than 50% of our visitors will say, oh, because someone advised me to come. It's word of mouth, which is of fundamental importance. So the more satisfied your visitors are, the better the word of mouth is, the easier it is to continue attracting, not to lose visitors, but to continue attracting new visitors. So that's something which was really in the DNA of this project from the outset. It's a project which really put a clear emphasis on the importance of the permanent exhibition, of the tourist, attracting tourists, and nonetheless, and the work of Melanie and her team, the cultural outreach team, is to highlight here, is that we're not running multiple exhibitions which are for multiple months. We have a more living cultural program, over 100 events per year, and that's about bringing local people in, people who can visit us more frequently. And in terms of costs, that's much cheaper than organizing a temporary artistic exhibition, for example. So our visitors, well, in theory, the majority of our visitors, they're first-time visitors. They come once every 10 years, especially, but they're about 10% which are regular visitors. And our whole economic model is designed around prioritizing that permanent exhibition, which accounts for 95% of our ticket sales. Okay, so before we continue, I wanted to open up the floor to questions from the room, if anyone has any questions or comments. Yes, Thank you, Madame Bernard. I'm a doctoral student in communication sciences at Bordeaux, working on specifically on the architecture of wine cellars in the Bordeaux region. It was very interesting to hear you. So I'm sorry, I can't pronounce your name very well, Carmen. I'm not going to try to pronounce your surname. I was interested in what you were saying about Mr. Vivanco's desire to share with society more broadly what he had gained from wine, what wine had given him. I thought that was a really nice way of giving back to society, what wine had given him. And it brings me back to a point I wanted to make about, you talked a lot this morning about history, about the roots in time. Emanuela and others have talked a lot about ancient history, the ancient roots of wine culture. It reminds me of the vergetisme. It's a concept, vergetisme. This is particularly in this is senators in ancient Greek, vergetism. This was the ancient Greek senators from wealthy families would finance public works as a gesture of goodwill towards society and sort of recognition for the riches, the wealth that they had inherited. So I mean, this idea, wine is 8,000 years old. They were long set in culture, but that idea that it's a recurring through the history of wine, the wealth of wine is returned to the community in the form of architecture. These are rich people who could have just, made their own wine cellar with the best technology to make it just for their own, to put it in like a big shoebox and a very boring looking building. Instead of that, they've decided to make an aesthetic gesture to make these attractions for visitors. And I think that is a form of investment, which brings to mind the traditions of ancient Greece. And I found that was really interesting to find those echoes down through the millennia. Thank you. Yes, that's why I say it is a luxury to work on a project such as this, because first and foremost, the vision of our museum, it's a universalist vision, much like the Cité du Vin. It would have been easy, of course, to make a museum dedicated to the history of the Vivanco family or Museum of Rioja. But that's not our vision. It's not a localist museum. It's a universalist vision, because Pedro, who is the Greek, one of the right at the vanguard of the development of Rioja, he got the medal for great contributions, the medal of labour from the Spanish government. And so in recognition of all his work, it's a very rare accolade. But above and beyond, in addition to being a collector, Pedro Vivanco did have that spirit of generosity, which allowed us to, what's the word I'm looking for in French here, to benefit from this cultural heritage that he accumulated, and it's a wonderful opportunity. Thank you. Okay, well, maybe without launching the debate about what's a museum, what's not a museum, I know that's a subject which a lot of you are very keen to talk about. But I'd like to go back to talk a little bit about the relationship between tangible material objects and intangible, immaterial objects. We've sort of touched upon it lightly a few times today. Do we need material, physical, tangible artifacts? Do you need to, for example, drink wine to be interested in the culture of wine? Manuela, you could, and Vanessa, I'd like to hear from you too on that subject. I would say that the tangible physical artifact's important, but it's not the be-all and end-all. What's important is that, as our colleague for our university and academic friend was just mentioned, we haven't talked much about it so far, but culture is an opportunity for different experiences. We're talking about tourism today, visiting a winery, visiting a barrel cellar, it can become very samey very often if you're visiting, you go around the barrels and then you end up tasting. But creating a cultural experience which really tells you something about the story of the place, of the owners of the land, the architect, even maybe modern architecture or older, that all adds up to create an experience. It's something that gives you license to dream. I talked a bit about dreams earlier, the power of dreams, and that ordinary dream-like dimension is important. It's not just about the tangible physical artifacts before you. We were talking about this a couple of days ago with Vanessa and myself about in Moldova, they did an advertising campaign. In other countries, they don't have the same kind of, I mean, not other countries have the riches that we have in Greece, Italy, France and Spain, architecture, but they really focus their advertising campaign not on the architectural visible things, but on the know-how, on the expertise. It was about folk traditions also, music, arts, or the living heritage, the intangible living heritage of Moldova. And so if we can do something similar, I think then visible, tangible artifacts become, it's not... You don't forget it, but it takes on a lesser significance if we begin to foreground our collective stories, our dreams, our collective intangible heritage. That could be something which can really engage and interest visitors more than the physical artifacts. But that really depends on the way that you share and transmit that intangible heritage. Because you've got to be able to create the narrative and transmit the narrative. If it's information, is it the format in which you tell that story? How do you convey that sense of intangible heritage? How do you, using innovative technologies, for example, like the Cité du Vin does so well, and in the Cité du Climat in Burgundy does a good job of that also. I talked a little bit earlier about the Olympiad. In the Olympiad route, there's no tangible heritage to see, but there is a history there. There is a story there. You don't need physical artifacts to get people imagining and driven that they are on the site where the Olympic Games were held in antiquity, and you don't need physical artifacts sometimes to get people using their imaginations and engaging with the place. Philippe and then Vanessa first. Yes, very briefly, if I may. I'll start. I think we're having a little debate about object, not object, tangible, intangible. It's all a matter of interpretation. And the different generations of museography through history, or different ways of presenting objects, ideas. Artifacts have always been embodiments of practices, of history, of know-how. But in the way we design and present museums, we can use artifacts in different ways. If you're in a science museum or a social museum, they're used to illustrate an idea that we're trying to present to the public. So it's certain that at a museum, the aura that surrounds the physical artifact really is irreplaceable. But it's something that you can build upon. These days, museums are more distributed; they're more decentralized. You see that in the Musée du Vin, and in the 2003 museum convention that we have. I think we've seen a real shift, a cultural shift, away from artifacts more to the human dimension. And we use artifacts, we use physical objects as a way of entry and to explain human life, human activity. I mean, archaeology remains irreplaceable, but I think it's just there are so many resources available, particularly around the culture of vines and wines, that allows us to tap into that shared cultural heritage. There are so many digital outreach technologies available. Artificial intelligence is making inroads now also. Sometimes we lose sight of the basic common sense, and I think with the culture of wine and vines is all about creating connections. It's always been about creating connections, and I think that we should never lose sight of that. Thank you. If I add two things. When we were putting together the Cité du Vin, where the idea was taking shape of what it could, we did ask ourselves, what place would artworks, artifacts have? And we decided that in Bordeaux we already have some beautiful museums which have excellent collections of artworks and historical artifacts. So we very quickly decided to do something different. And so in the first incarnation of our permanent visitors exhibition that we had when we opened 10 years ago, some of the feedback we get, they would say it seems a little dehumanized. And they don't mean that there was lacking a human presence, but it was the fact that the images that we'd chosen, this was the original incarnation of the visitor experience, the fact that there was not enough human presence. In 2023, we added a lot more elements relating to nature and to humans, to people, and we get far less feedback saying that it's not human, that's dehumanized somehow. in 2023, we also added some new artworks, such as more physical artifacts, coincidentally. But perhaps in years to come, there'll be further changes in that respect. But that was my first point. The second point I wanted to raise was that what unites us all, I think, is the shared sense of the importance of identity. All of the projects we represent here, it's all about reflecting and championing the identity of our territories. And there are a lot of visitors who come to us who aren't particularly interested in wine. They're not wine specialists or wine connoisseurs. Some say, oh, I'll drink a bit of wine occasionally, but they're not that interested. But it really is part of my heritage. I have recognized the cultural and historical importance of wine. So when they choose to come and visit us, if it's here in Bordeaux, in Rioja, in Burgundy, it's because they have a certain amount of interest. If you absolutely hate wine or you have no interest in wine whatsoever, well, you'll go and do something else. You might go visit a different city, go and visit another region for your weekend break. Marseille, for example, has it's a cave museum, which is right near the Museum. The first year, really busy. And then visitor numbers just completely dropped off. And why? Well, because tourists go to Marseille, they're not expecting to hear about prehistory. So this prehistoric museum, Marseille was just not identified as a visitor site for prehistory. Oh, I had another question about, you talked about narrative storytelling, tangible and intangible, but let's talk a bit about wine. We do the example of the climat of Burgundy, the little dim close. How do you convey something so abstract and intangible, something which is so difficult to explain, particularly to an audience of visitors who are often international visitors? You say 60% of your visitors in Burgundy are international visitors. How do you convey that abstract, intangible, difficult to understand technical idea? You talked about multidisciplinary approaches a little bit earlier. There's obviously, there's a demand of technological expertise. Perhaps a biologist would be helpful. Yeah, once again, the question itself is excellent. These are questions that we've had to ask us. Bernard Charente, president, he's here with me today. We'll be able to tell you more about it than I can. He was very deeply involved in the discussions, the reflections over the production, how we would translate into physical, into educational terms of what this relatively complex idea of what a climat is. I wouldn't even attempt to define exactly what a Burgundy climat is. But once again, the idea was to make this concept, which, once again, this really is at the very essence of what makes Burgundy wine so specific, because we have climat, which has just a fundamental importance. So we really had to convey that complex concept in a way which is fun, which is approachable, and which visitors can understand. So that took a lot of discussion. It's not something which is fixed and set in stone either. Certainly, as what we've, as you can tell from the changes that we've recently made to the visitor experience, it's constantly evolving and changing. And that does tell you something about the concerns that we had. That we worried that would not be accessible and understandable enough to visitors. Again, never losing sight of the fact that it's about making this accessible and interesting to visitors, engaging the visitor. So we did a lot of work on texture, on interactivity with different stations with different experiences. But it's a question which we're constantly re-asking ourselves, because Philippe expressed this very well. Satisfaction, visitor satisfaction is, to achieve visitor satisfaction, they need to understand and really understand what we're trying to get across. And so in that, the notion of climat is particularly important. And we learn from our experiences, and we attempt to continuously improve. Okay, I think we've got time for just one question from someone from the museum sector. Oh yeah, you get this is the question box. If you want to ask a question, we'll throw a microphone at your head. Please don't throw it at the camera, though. Does it work there? No, it's not working. Sorry, I can't hear the question. We have to speak into the microphone. because rather than talk about dichotomy about tangible and intangible artifacts, the real question is how we present these things with the could be, for example, if you're trying to tell the story of the history of winemaking, wine growing techniques, or the artistic fact associations and the historical associations that go along with it. Sorry, I can't hear what she's saying. So the question is not so much about whether we use artifacts or not artifacts, it's what we do with them, how we communicate, how we share. Because there are some museums that have far too many items and on display at times. So the question really is not so much do you have artifacts or artifacts, it's how you present the story, how you communicate the history, because artifacts, they can be very evocative as long as they're used correctly. And then it's all about using artifacts in the service of telling a bigger story. Because if it's interesting, we have those different technology ways of presenting ideas and adding context and explaining is very interesting. But perhaps sometimes having the physical artifact does add another dimension. So artifacts do have a role to play in giving that perhaps human, tangible touch. It may only be a dozen, it may be 100. It depends on the dimension of your exhibition. So that's why it really is an issue of the work of a curator. And I'm speaking as a museum professional here. I think that it's museums, obviously, because they're not. There is a difference between a museum and a visitor centre. Museums have legal obligations in terms of conserving and preserving historical artifacts. But the question, again, I'll say it is: there's the artifacts. There's the less important. The real question is not to display or not display artifacts. It's how to tell the story, how to put these artifacts to the service of the story we're trying to tell. And all the experiences and how they tie into all the experiences, the fun experiences that may have and how there are many different ways of approaching this question. There's no right and wrong way of doing it. And the other, and this is actually, I am going to ask a question now. I'm thinking a little bit about what Pascaline said this morning in her presentation. You talked about community earlier. And I'm sure that everyone in this room, I'm sure everyone will agree that wine is a drink of great civilizational importance. It's excellent. It has such deep associations with archaeology, history, religion, etc. We know how important wine is to the history of Europe. I'm sure we all appreciate that. But some people, many people in the world today, from different parts of the world, for different generations, younger generations, don't necessarily have that same appreciation of wine. Yeah, I'm sure all of us here are convinced that wine's wonderful, has a wonderful story to tell. Well, Bordeaux, Burgundy, Champagne, Cognac, wherever it may be. But the real question, I think, is how do we engage with an audience which doesn't have those same assumptions, people who don't have that culture, who don't automatically have a belief in the cultural importance of wine. So the question then is how, and I go back to what you were saying about the connection with art and archaeology, to transcending wine as a simple drink and telling a bigger story. Seeing the bigger picture than simply the wine as a liquid. But the question then is how do we engage with those communities, other groups of visitors for whom wine isn't such an automatically understood phenomenon? Thank you, Laure. That actually provides us a very interesting point of transition for the second part of today's colloquium, which will be after lunch when we go talking about new ways of imagining and conceiving wine. And Véronique Le Mans hinted a little bit this earlier in her presentation about the stories around wine, the narratives around wine, and wine and civilization. Perhaps we can have one last point before lunch and this does perhaps tie into the debate about materiality, I mean, artifacts and no artifacts. How about the presence of nature, the natural context? How we present exhibitions and how do we present artifacts? How do we deal with the very sensitive subject these days of nature, whether with tourists, with scientists, with experts, wine lovers? Nature takes on different forms, and there are lots of new associations and ideas and imaginations with the relationship between nature and wine. Who wants to take up this subject first? Perhaps Emanuela, with the wine roots. Of course, they combine culture with wine and nature. Yes, well, we talked a lot about landscape, the importance of landscape, and I think we do need to replace wine in its context, in its natural context, that show that a certain wine, if it tastes a certain way, it's because it comes from this landscape, from this natural environment. It's the climate, the terroir, and landscapes are natural, but they're also the fruit of the relationship between man and nature. They're not into exactly nature. If you're planting on, the terraces that we cut into volcanic soils, or the vines planted in those goblet-proof formations, that's not natural. That's the result of the fruit of the interaction between humans and the landscape. And so it is important to study and convey that as part of the story. The relationship between man and nature is a key part of the narrative. To talk about nature more specifically, I think the most important example we have at the moment is the urban wineries. Is a really interesting example of attempts to bring nature back into the city, to rebuild urban natural landscapes that existed in the past, to reconnect with history, but to rediscover that connection with nature. I mean, in some respects, a winery is an open-air museum. I've seen some in Brasilia. In Brazil, there's a new, fairly recent urban vineyard, which I think is a really interesting example of reinvesting that connection with nature and rediscovering urban landscapes. For example, another example would be having hiking trails, walking trails through vineyards. It's not strictly speaking wine tourism. You're there for, you're walking, you're hiking, but and you may go from one archaeological site to another, or from one museum to another. But nature it's absolutely inextricably linked up with this. It's part of the even, and that could be in the urban landscape as well as right out in the countryside. But if I may, I could give you one example which may be of interest. I was in Greece recently, because they do these things very well in Greece. So it was a museum of musical instruments, which had a connection to winemaking as well, because it was in these are instruments which would have been used out in the vineyards historically, or also instruments that people would be playing while they were drinking wine or while they were distilling raki. And I was lucky enough to be with a musician and a historian of music who was with me, and he pulled out one of the instruments and played it for me. And I said, wow, if you're not there, people don't get that experience. What's the point of this? So, it's a wonderful experience, but not everyone would get that. Got me to thinking about how you could do a better job of presenting that heritage and safeguarding this person. Because this person, it's great to have the musical instrument, but that person with that who knows how to play to the instrument, he's like a living heritage himself. And so perhaps they could think about having a bit of music. These instruments are very simple. They're very simple stringed instruments. So I'm not a musician. I wouldn't have of my own understood how it would have been played. So it would be important then to have like a bit of a bit of music or a video clip, because you've got to think about not just the artifact. How do you bring the artifacts to life, and to not to want people to be bored in front of objects that they don't necessarily understand. Okay, we'll have a quick look at Herbs' latest cartoon for us. Museums are getting complicated, and in the frame it says, "Why don't you go look at the countryside instead?" I had an interesting just response to what you just said about that musical instrument museum. And there's a solution in the east of France where they have a museum of instruments. They have hidden speakers which play the sound of each instrument being played. Because you're right, otherwise, if you can't hear what the instrument sounds like, then it's not so interesting. That's one solution. They have these hidden speakers which play the sound of each of the instruments which is on display. And I thought that was an interesting way of bringing those objects to life. Not easy to do in the wine context, I know, but I mean, you could perhaps potentially, if you go out to visit a chateau out of season, because if you go to see a wine cellar out of season, it's not very interesting. There's not a lot going on. So perhaps they could have videos showing what it's like when the wine is actually being made or during the harvest. And you could have a 360 more immersive experience, and then to show you what the vineyard looks like in different seasons of the year. You could have just a brief 20-minute video to shows you a year in the life of the vineyard. There are plenty of solutions. There are plenty of things that can be done to make the visits more immersive, more interactive, rather than just having a simple looking at objects and artifacts. So thank you. And I suggest that it's time to very warmly thank our panelists.